Welcome to the Talking Ketamine podcast, the show where we explore the science behind this fascinating molecule. This is episode 38, a flawed ketamine trial.
Thanks for joining us. Today we're tackling a new major study, the KarmaDep-2 trial, that just published a pretty shocking headline. It found that serial ketamine infusions were no better than a placebo for hospitalized patients with depression.
Wow, yeah, that headline certainly grabbed my attention. It feels, counterintuitive, especially with all the hope around ketamine for depression.
Exactly. But before we jump to conclusions, we really need to set the stage. We're talking about major depressive disorder, MDD. The burden is just immense.
It really is. Lifetime prevalence is what, somewhere between 12 and 20%? That's huge.
Staggering. And, the treatments we have often fall short. Think about the STARD study, that big real-world look at antidepressants.
Right, the one that showed only about 30% of people actually get remission from the first SSRI they try.
Precisely. And if that first one doesn't work, the options get tougher. It highlights this desperate need for something new, something that works fast.
Which is where ketamine seems so promising. And this KarmaDep-2 trial, it was set up to really test that promise in a very specific, very difficult group, patients actually hospitalized for their depression.
Yeah, the design is important here. It's a phase 3 trial, pragmatic, meaning more like real-world conditions, randomized, controlled. They took inpatients with moderate to severe depression, so a MADAS score of 20 or more.
And the treatment was pretty intense, wasn't it? Up to 8 infusions.
Twice a week, yeah. So up to 8 infusions. Half got ketamine, the standard 0.5 milligrams over 40 minutes. The other half got midazolam, 0.045 milligrams as a comparator.
Midazolam, will definitely need to talk more about that choice later.
Absolutely. But the main goal, the primary endpoint, was the difference in MADAS scores 24 hours after that last infusion. Plus, they followed patients for a long time, 24 weeks.
And the pragmatic part means patients kept getting their usual care, other meds, therapy.
Exactly. Which is good for seeing how it works in the real world, makes it generalizable. But it also adds noise, more variability, makes it harder to tease out the drug's specific effect if it's small.
And this wasn't their first shot at this, right? There's a pilot study first.
That's key. KarmaDep-2 followed a pilot trial. The pilot also used midazolam, but gave infusions only once a week.
And how did that go?
Well, it was kind of a warning sign, maybe. They found only a tiny difference, minus 2.6 points on a different scale, the HRSD-24. And crucially, it wasn't statistically significant.
Minus 2.6 points. That sounds really small. Clinically meaningful.
Probably not. It's a kind of difference that could easily just be chance. So the researchers thought, okay, maybe once a week isn't enough. Let's try twice a week for the main trial, KarmaDep-2.
Hoping that doubling the frequency would finally show a clear win for ketamine.
That was the hope. But like we said at the start, it didn't work out that way. No significant difference, even with twice-weekly infusions compared to midazolam.
Okay, so if ketamine didn't beat the control, we absolutely have to dig into that control. Midazolam. This seems like the core issue in a lot of ketamine research.
It really is. It boils down to blinding. Ketamine has these very noticeable, unique effects, the dissociation. It's almost impossible for someone not to know if they got ketamine or just, say, saline.
And if you know you got this special drug, your expectation goes way up, right? Which can influence how you feel.
Exactly. So researchers use midazolam, it's a benzodiazepine, as an active placebo. The idea is it causes some sedation, maybe a little disorientation, enough nonspecific effects to hopefully confuse things a bit and keep the blind intact, or at least more intact than saline would.
But how well does it actually work? Does choosing midazolam change how effective ketamine looks? There was that meta-analysis, Wilkinson, was it?
Yes, Wilkinson et al., 2019, super important piece. They looked directly at this, ketamine versus midazolam compared to ketamine versus saline in adults.
And the results were pretty stark, as I recall.
Dramatic, really. Ketamine's effect size, that's D, a measure of effectiveness, was much smaller against midazolam. It was D equal 0.7. But against saline, it shot up to D 1.8.
Wait, so the effect looked more than twice as strong just by swapping saline for midazolam. How does that happen?
It wasn't that ketamine did worse against midazolam, it's that midazolam did better than saline. The midazolam control groups had about an 18% response rate on day 1.
18%, okay. And the saline groups?
Almost nothing, like a 1% response rate. Really, really low.
Wow. So that 18% response with midazolam, that sounds more like what you'd expect from a placebo effect in typical antidepressant trials, doesn't it? Those often run around 20%, maybe higher sometimes.
Exactly the point. It suggests midazolam does a better job of mimicking some effect, keeping the blind better, and capturing that expected placebo, or expectancy response. Saline is just too obviously inert.
So the interpretation is midazolam gives a more realistic estimate of ketamine's true effect, filtering out some of that pure expectation.
That's the argument. And if that's true, then CarmaDeb-2 finding no difference from midazolam suggests that maybe the actual pharmacological benefit of serial ketamine in that setting is pretty small once you account for that strong midazolam placebo effect.
Okay, so that's the picture in adults who are hospitalized. But what about other groups? Like adolescents, their brains are different. Maybe their expectations are too.
Great question, and that leads us to another key study, Dwyer and colleagues, 2021. This was smaller, a proof-of-concept trial, randomized crossover design. Only 17 adolescents, 13 to 17 years old, with treatment-resistant depression. And crucially, they also used midazolam as the control.
And the results were different.
Completely different outcome. Here, a single ketamine infusion was significantly better than midazolam at 24 hours. The mean difference on the mid-ORIS was -8.69 points.
Okay, -8.69, that sounds much more substantial than the 2.6 in the Karma pilot. What was the effect size?
It was DVO 0.78. Robust.
Interesting, 0.78. That's actually very close to the zero point 0.7 effect size the Wilkinson meta-analysis found for ketamine versus midazolam in adults.
It is, yeah. Suggests maybe midazolam's consistently setting a similar bar, but in the adolescents, ketamine cleared it, whereas in the CarmaDeb-2 adults, it didn't.
What about response rates in the Dwyer study?
Pretty impressive. 76% responded to ketamine within 3 days. For midazolam, it was 35%. Still a decent response to midazolam, actually.
But wait, if midazolam is meant to help with blinding, did it work in the adolescent trial? Did they ask the kids?
They did, for a subset. And this really gets back to the core problem. 10 out of 10 kids who got ketamine correctly guessed they got ketamine.
10 out of 10, so 0 blinding on the ketamine side.
Pretty much functional unblinding. For midazolam, only 5 out of 10 guessed correctly so. Basically chance.
So even though ketamine works significantly better, you have this massive confound where everyone knew they got the active drug. How much of that 76% response is pharmacology versus just powerful expectation because they felt those weird ketamine effects?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really hard to untangle. You feel something dramatic happening. You know it's the drug everyone's talking about. That's powerful medicine in itself.
Okay, before we try to reconcile these conflicting findings, what about safety? Was ketamine safe in these trials, especially for the adolescents?
Yeah, overall, the safety profile looked pretty consistent between the Karma pilot protocol and the Dwyer adolescent study. Generally well tolerated.
So the usual stuff, dissociation, blood pressure bumps.
Exactly. Transient, self-limiting things. In the Dwyer study, like 100% of the kids getting ketamine had some dissociation, but it resolved quickly, back to baseline by 2 hours post-infusion, some temporary increases in heart rate, blood pressure. Importantly, no serious adverse events in that adolescent trial.
Good. Okay, one last piece before we wrap up. You mentioned the MADRS scale earlier, using scales designed for slow-acting drugs to measure rapid ketamine effects. That seems tricky.
It's a real challenge. These scales, like Matter-Day or HAM-D, they weren't built for this. They ask about things over the past week, like sleep, appetite. How do you answer that 24 hours after an infusion?
Right. Did the CarmaDeb-2 trial address that?
They did. The protocol actually specified that for certain items, MADRS items 4 and 5, sleep and appetite, the scores had to be carried over from the baseline assessment during those immediate post-infusion checks.
Carried over. So they just assumed those things couldn't change that fast.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Because the question format doesn't really work acutely. The Dwyer adolescent trial also mentioned problems with their scale, the pediatric CDRS-R, items like school performance.
Yeah.
You just can't assess that meaningfully in 24 hours.
So is it possible that these measurement tools, even with adaptations, are kind of blunt instruments here? Could they be missing or, I don't know, dampening a real rapid effect, especially in a complex trial like CarmaDeb-2? It's definitely a possibility we have to consider. Trying to measure a potentially sharp, quick change with tools designed for gradual improvement, you might lose some of the signal in the noise or in the necessary workarounds like carrying scores over.
Okay, so let's pull it together. We have CarmaDeb-2, a big pragmatic trial in hospitalized adults showing serial ketamine is no better than midazolam. We know midazolam itself likely produces a decent placebo expectancy effect, maybe around 18%.
Right, setting a high bar.
Then we have the Dwyer trial in adolescents. Single dose, also against midazolam. Here, ketamine is significantly better, but the blinding was clearly compromised, especially for ketamine. High expectation likely played a role.
And across the board, safety looks generally acceptable for acute use, but measuring the rapid effects accurately remains a challenge.
It really forces us back to this central issue, the control group. Midazolam gives us that 18% response floor. If ketamine pharmacologically only adds a bit more on top of that, especially in complex inpatient settings, how do we reliably measure that? And maybe more importantly, how much does that extra bit matter clinically if the overall experience and expectation are already driving a significant portion of the improvement?
It makes you wonder. If achieving a truly perfect blind with a drug like ketamine is basically impossible because its effects are so unique, should we even keep trying with placebo controls for these rapid-acting drugs?
Or perhaps the focus needs to shift entirely. Maybe more head-to-head trials against existing active treatments rather than trying to isolate the effect from placebo or expectancy.
It really leaves you thinking about how we design studies for these fundamentally different kinds of treatments. Does chasing the perfect blind end up obscuring the real-world value, or is it essential to understanding the true mechanism? Where's that line between the drug effect and the psychological power of the experience?
Definitely something to chew on. The results from Karma Dep 2, placed alongside the other evidence, don't give easy answers, that's for sure.